At 8:40 on a Monday morning, my young wife placed a heavy brass pen in my hand and told me it was time to let the farm go. Across my kitchen table sat two land acquisition executives in charcoal suits. Their contract was already open. The sale price was circled in blue ink, $2.4 million. $2.4 million sounded like a fortune. That was exactly why Serena had chosen the number. High enough to tempt an old rancher, low enough to steal what was buried beneath him. Serena squeezed my shoulder and smiled like a woman saving an old man from himself. "You can finally rest, Elias," she whispered. "No more broken fences, no more cattle, no more winters alone out here." Then my daughter Claire stepped into the kitchen, holding a manila folder so tightly the edges bent in her hands. "Dad," she said, "don't sign that." Serena sighed. "This is exactly what I warned you about," she said. "Claire only cares because she thinks the farm will be hers one day." But Claire was not looking at the contract. She was looking at Serena. "She isn't selling the farm because it's too much work," Claire said. "She's selling it because of what's under it." Serena's hand froze on my shoulder. Claire opened the folder and laid a bound report on top of the sale contract. Asterisk, preliminary lithium and rare earth mineral assessment. Whitaker Ranch. Then, Claire turned to the final page. A private finder's fee, a non-disclosure agreement, and at the bottom, my wife's signature. I did not pick up the pen. I picked up the report. I set the brass pen down beside the contract. For the first time that morning, Serena was the one watching my hands. I had thought my daughter was fighting my wife over land. I had thought I was caught in the middle of a tragic, ordinary conflict between an aging man's new love and his protective child. I was wrong. My daughter was fighting to show me why my wife wanted me tired enough to sign. That was the moment I realized Serena had never hated the farm. She didn't hate the broken fences, or the early mornings, or the dirt on the floorboards. She just hated that it belonged to my family before it could belong to her. To understand why a man would hesitate to take $2.4 million and walk away, you have to understand what the Whitaker Ranch actually was. It wasn't just an asset. It wasn't a portfolio investment to be liquidated when the market peaked. It was our blood. My grandfather had cleared the original 90 acres with hand tools and draft horses. My father had fought the banks, the droughts, and a devastating cattle blight in the 70s to keep the deed out of foreclosure. By the time the land passed to me, it was 300 acres of prime grazing pasture and rugged timberline, soaked in the sweat of the men who had come before me. But it was my wife, Ruth, who truly gave the land its soul. Ruth was a force of nature. She wasn't born to a ranching family, but when I brought her to the Whitaker property as a young bride, she didn't just tolerate the isolation. She embraced it. She learned to mend barbed wire, to pull a stuck calf in the middle of a blizzard, to balance the precarious, terrifying ledger of a working agricultural business. When Claire was born, Ruth strapped her to her chest in a canvas carrier and walked the fence lines, teaching our daughter the name of every native grass and soil type before the girl could even spell them. Land remembers who stayed. Elias. Ruth used to tell me, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as we watched the sun set over the western ridge. Dirt doesn't care about the name on a piece of paper. It cares about who bleeds for it. For 35 years, Ruth and I bled for the Whitaker Ranch. We built a beautiful, grueling, incredibly fulfilling life. And then, 5 years ago, the cancer came. It was aggressive, fast, and completely indifferent to how hard we fought. In less than 8 months, the vibrant, unstoppable woman who had run this ranch alongside me was confined to a hospital bed set up in the very kitchen where I was now sitting. Claire had taken a leave of absence from her environmental engineering firm to help me care for her, but the inevitable could not be stopped. 2 days before Ruth passed away, she asked Claire to leave the room. She wanted to speak to me alone. Her breathing was shallow, her hands painfully thin, but her eyes were as sharp and clear as a winter morning. "Elias," she had whispered, gripping my calloused hand with surprising strength. "I'm right here, Ruth." "You are going to be so lonely," she said, tears finally slipping down her pale cheeks. "You are going to be lonely. And this house is going to feel entirely too big. And eventually, you're going to get tired. The winters are going to hurt your joints. The work is going to feel like too much for one old man." I kissed her knuckles, unable to speak through the massive, suffocating lump in my throat. "Promise me something," Ruth whispered, her voice taking on a fierce, desperate urgency. "Promise me you won't sell because someone makes loneliness sound like rest. If anyone ever tells you this land is too much for you, ask whether they love you enough to keep it, or only want you tired enough to sign it away." I promised her. 2 days later, she was gone. We buried her in the small family plot on the eastern ridge, beneath a massive oak tree she had loved since the day we met. The silence that followed her death was deafening. Ruth was right. The house felt like a tomb. I threw myself into the grueling physical labor of the ranch, working from before sunrise until well past dark, trying to exhaust my body so my mind wouldn't have the energy to grieve. Claire tried to stay, but I pushed her away, insisting she return to her career. I didn't want her pausing her life to watch me decay in an empty farmhouse. For 3 years, I lived in total isolation, speaking only to the cattle, the feed store clerks, and occasionally my closest neighbor, an old rancher named Hank Miller. Then I met Serena. I had driven into town to attend a regional agricultural supply auction, looking for a replacement part for a baler. Serena was working for the auction house, handling the registration desk. She was 27 years younger than me, beautiful, bright, and incredibly attentive. She noticed that I was limping from a recent knee strain. She noticed that I looked tired. She didn't ask me about cattle prices or weather patterns. She asked me if I had eaten lunch. It started with coffee. Then, she drove out to the ranch to drop off some paperwork I had forgotten. She saw the dust on the baseboards. She saw the empty chairs at the dinner table. She didn't look at the ranch with awe or intimidation. She looked at it with pity. I should have recognized the danger then. I should have remembered Ruth's warning. But grief is a master manipulator, and loneliness is a remarkably effective anesthetic. When Serena looked at me with those wide, concerned eyes and told me I deserved to be taken care of, I didn't hear a threat. I just heard a way out of the silence. We were married 14 months later. Claire had objected, expressing deep, uncomfortable concerns about the suddenness of the union and the massive age gap, but I had stubbornly ignored her. I told myself Claire was just grieving her mother. Unable to accept that I needed companionship, I moved Serena into the farmhouse, bringing a young, vibrant life into a space that had been defined by memory and loss. I thought I was saving myself. I didn't realize I was simply opening the front gate and inviting the wolf into the pasture. To orchestrate a betrayal of that magnitude, Serena couldn't just walk into the farmhouse and put a sale contract on the table. She had to meticulously dismantle my support system first. She had to replace the legacy of my late wife, Ruth, with her own voice, and she had to sever the one tie that could anchor me to the truth. My daughter, Claire. It didn't happen in a single argument. It happened in 1,000 tiny, sympathetic cuts. It started about 8 months after we were married. I had come inside after a grueling 14-hour day, repairing a washed-out section of the western fence. My knee was throbbing, and I was moving with the stiff, careful gait of a man who knew he was pushing his body past its limits. Serena had drawn a hot bath for me. She had a plate of food waiting on the table. She sat across from me as I ate, her expression a picture of pure, heartbroken concern. "Elias," she said softly, reaching across the table to cover my rough, calloused hand with her own. "You can't keep doing this. I watched you walk from the truck. You were wincing with every step." "It's just the cold damp," I told her, trying to shrug it off. "It flares up. I'll be fine tomorrow." "No, you won't," she insisted gently. This place is consuming you. I know Ruth loved this farm. I know you both built a life here. But Ruth is not the one waking up with your knees in pain. Ruth isn't the one who might have a heart attack out in the pasture where no one can find you. She used Ruth's name like a scalpel, cutting away my loyalty under the guise of medical concern. Love is knowing when to save a man from his own stubbornness, Serena added, her voice thick with emotion. I just want you to be safe, Elias. Over the next few months, that concern mutated into a subtle, relentless campaign against Claire. Claire was busy. She worked long hours as a regional agricultural consultant, traveling across the state to advise on soil health and crop rotation. She called me twice a week and came out to the ranch whenever she could, but Serena made sure every absence felt like an abandonment. When Claire missed a Sunday dinner because of a sudden freeze warning at a client's orchard, Serena sighed as she cleared the plates. I just wish she would prioritize you, Serena murmured. She has time for everyone else's land, but not her own father. When Claire suggested I hire a part-time hand to help with the heavy lifting, Serena twisted the advice into a weapon. Notice how she wants you to spend your savings to keep the farm running, but she won't come do the work herself. Serena whispered to me late one night. She just wants to make sure the inheritance is intact, Elias. She's waiting for the land, but she's perfectly fine letting you break your back to hold on to it for her. I defended my daughter at first. I told Serena that Claire wasn't like that. But the relentless dripping of poison into my ear, combined with my own physical exhaustion, began to wear me down. I started to resent Claire's advice. I started to see her independence as neglect. I didn't know that while Serena was busy isolating me in the farmhouse, she was already inviting strangers onto my land. The unraveling of Serena's pristine loving facade didn't start with me. It started with an old rancher named Hank Miller, whose property bordered my eastern ridge. Hank was 70 years old, half deaf in one ear, and possessed the kind of sharp, territorial awareness that only comes from staring at the same horizon for 5 decades. He knew every truck that drove down the county road, and he knew exactly when a vehicle didn't belong. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Serena had insisted on driving me into Denver for a relaxing day in the city and an appointment with a specialist for my knee. We were gone for 10 hours. While we were sitting in a high-end restaurant, Hank was sitting on his porch with a pair of binoculars. He saw 2 unmarked, heavy-duty utility trucks turn off the county road and pass through the back gate of the Whitaker Ranch. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and a padlock. Only 3 people had the key: me, Claire, and Serena. The men in the trucks didn't cut the chain, they unlocked it. Hank watched them drive out to the deep pasture, set up a mobile drilling rig, and spend 6 hours extracting deep core soil samples. Hank didn't call me. He knew Serena managed my phone when we were in the city. He called Claire. "Your mother bled for that fence line, Claire," Hank told her over the phone, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I figured somebody ought to tell you when strangers start measuring it while your daddy's out of town." Claire didn't immediately accuse Serena. My daughter was a scientist. She didn't operate on suspicion. She operated on data. She drove out to the ranch the next day while Serena was at the grocery store. She found the tire tracks. She found the small, perfectly cylindrical boreholes left in the earth, hastily covered with loose dirt. As a soil consultant, Claire knew exactly what those holes meant. They weren't testing for agricultural nutrients. They were drilling deep. They were looking for minerals. Claire drove straight to the county clerk's office. She requested the recent public logs for any land use permits or survey requests filed in the area. She found a temporary geological survey permit filed under a Shell LLC. Claire traced the LLC's registration back to a parent company, Apex Minerals, a mid-sized mining corporation specializing in lithium and rare earth extraction. But a mining company couldn't just drill on private property without permission. Someone had to sign a legal access waiver. Claire knew I hadn't signed anything. I didn't even know what rare earth minerals were. She went back to the ranch house 3 days later, arriving unannounced while Serena was in the shower. Claire walked into the home office, a room Serena had essentially taken over, claiming she was organizing my messy paperwork. Claire didn't tear the room apart. She simply opened the web browser on the desktop computer Serena used for household accounting. Serena had left her email logged in. There, sitting plainly in a folder labeled Denver Transition, was an email chain with a man named Marcus Vale, an executive at Apex Minerals. Claire opened the attachments. What she found wasn't just a betrayal. It was a perfectly orchestrated corporate heist. The first document was a preliminary lithium and rare earth mineral assessment. The deep core samples taken from the eastern ridge had confirmed a massive, highly concentrated lithium brine deposit sitting directly beneath the Whitaker Ranch. The report estimated the subsurface rights alone were worth upwards of $30 million. The second document was the real estate contract Marcus Vale was preparing to offer me. It was a standard agricultural land purchase agreement for $2.4 million. But buried on page 17, under a dense thicket of legal jargon, was a clause transferring all subsurface rights, water access rights, and future mineral claims to the buyer in perpetuity. Marcus Vale was going to offer me agricultural value for a multi-million-dollar lithium mine. But the third document was the one that made Claire physically sick. It was a private commission and finder's fee agreement. In exchange for securing the sale of the Whitaker Ranch to Apex Minerals, and specifically ensuring that the subsurface rights were included without an independent appraisal, Serena would receive a 7% consulting fee based on the future valuation of the mineral lease. Serena wasn't just selling my farm to move us to Denver. She was acting as a paid corporate broker, manipulating her husband into signing away generational wealth so she could collect a massive, secret commission. And she had to get me to sign it before I found out what was under the dirt. Claire printed every single document. She placed them carefully into a manila folder, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. She didn't confront Serena right then. She knew that if she attacked Serena without me present, Serena would simply twist the narrative, play the victim, and accelerate the sale before Claire could intervene. Claire had to wait for the trap to snap shut. She had to let Serena bring the contract into the light, right up to the edge of the pen, so I could see the betrayal with my own eyes. If Dad wants to sell after knowing the truth, I'll accept it, Claire whispered to herself in the empty office, staring at her mother's handwriting on an old ledger across the room. But I will not watch him get tricked into signing away what Mom died protecting. 2 days later, Serena told me she had arranged a meeting with some very nice gentlemen who were interested in buying the farm above market value. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and told me my pain was finally over. She didn't know that my daughter was already standing at the gate, holding the one document that would burn her entire plan to the ground. To execute a theft of this magnitude, the timing had to be absolutely flawless. Apex Minerals didn't just want my land. They wanted it before the county finalized any new geological zoning regulations, and more importantly, they wanted it before anyone else realized there was a lithium brine deposit sitting beneath my cattle pastures. Serena, driven by an insatiable, breathless greed, had her own timeline. According to the private commission agreement Claire had found on the computer, Serena wasn't just receiving a standard finder's fee. She had negotiated a tiered bonus structure. If she could deliver my signature on the sale contract before the end of the fiscal quarter, which was only 9 days away, her commission percentage would double. She was racing against the clock, and I was the only obstacle in her way. The week leading up to the signing was a masterclass in psychological pressure disguised as domestic bliss. Serena didn't argue with me about the farm. Instead, She began acting as if the decision had already been made, gently weaving the inevitability of our departure into the fabric of my daily life. She started bringing home glossy real estate brochures from Denver. She would leave them open on the kitchen counter, highlighting properties with single-story layouts, walk-in showers, and mountain views. "Look at this one, Elias," she would say, wrapping her arms around my waist as I stood at the sink, staring out at the winter frost covering the eastern ridge. "No stairs for your knees. A heated garage. We could actually travel. We could go to Europe." "You've never been to Europe." "I don't know anything about Europe, Serena," I replied, my voice heavy with an exhaustion I couldn't entirely explain. "I know cattle, and you've done enough for them," she murmured, kissing my cheek. "It's time someone took care of you for a change." I didn't know that while she was kissing my cheek, she was texting the men who were trying to steal my legacy. Claire had printed copies of the email chains, but she had also managed to pull screenshots of a synced text message conversation between Serena and Marcus Vale, the lead acquisition executive for Apex Minerals. Reading those texts was like watching a predator discuss how to bleed its prey. "Marcus Vale, the contract is drafted. 24M offer. Standard agricultural terms on the front page, subsurface transfer buried in section 14. We need to move on this. Are we clear for Monday, Serena?" "Yes. Bring the paperwork to the house. It's better if he signs it here. He's emotional about the daughter. Keep the offer framed as relief, not profit. If you talk about money too much, he'll get suspicious." Marcus Vale understood. "If he asks any questions about mineral rights or subsurface exclusions, do not let the daughter speak. We cannot afford an independent review, Serena. He trusts me. That won't be a problem. I'll make sure Claire isn't here." Serena's confidence was absolute. She believed she had entirely successfully isolated me, turning me into a compliant, exhausted old man who would simply sign whatever was placed in front of him just to make the pain stop. The morning of the signing, the trap was set with terrifying precision. I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and bacon. Serena had been up since dawn. She was wearing a white silk blouse and a delicate gold necklace, looking polished, professional, and radiating an unsettling, frantic energy. I sat down at the heavy oak kitchen table, the same table where Ruth and I had spent 30 years balancing the ranch's ledgers, the same table where Claire had done her high school homework. Serena placed a plate of food in front of me and poured my coffee. "Today is a good day, Elias," she said, her eyes shining with a predatory brightness she couldn't quite conceal. "Today is the day you get your life back." At exactly 8:30 a.m., a black luxury SUV crunched up the gravel driveway. Two men stepped out. They were wearing sharp, charcoal gray suits that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of my weathered barn and the muddy tractor ruts in the yard. Serena practically floated to the door to let them in. "Elias." "This is Marcus Vale and his associate, Mr. Trent," Serena said, making the introductions with the smooth, practiced charm of a corporate hostess. Marcus Vale stepped into my kitchen. He was a man in his mid-40s with slicked-back hair, an expensive watch, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His associate, Trent, was carrying a thick leather briefcase. Trent was the attorney. He was there to make sure the theft was legally binding. "Mr. Whitaker," Marcus said, extending a manicured hand. "It's an absolute honor to meet you. Your wife has told us so much about the legacy of this ranch." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, practiced. "Let's sit down," Serena said, guiding them to the table. "I want to make this as easy on Elias as possible." Trent opened his briefcase and pulled out the thick, formal sale contract. He laid it flat on the oak table, smoothing the pages with his hands. Marcus Vale leaned forward, clasping his hands together, launching into the pitch Serena had coached him to deliver. "Mr. Whitaker, we know how much this land means to you," Marcus began, his voice perfectly modulated to convey deep, fabricated empathy. "But we also know the toll it's taking. Agricultural margins are shrinking. The physical labor is immense. We are prepared to offer you $2.4 million for the entirety of the Whitaker Ranch. He paused, letting the number hang in the air. As you know, Marcus continued smoothly, we are offering significantly above current agricultural value. That is more than fair for this region. We want to ensure you have the capital to retire comfortably, without the burden of maintaining this acreage. I looked at the contract. The price was circled in blue ink, $2.4 million. It was a staggering amount of money for a cattle ranch. It was the kind of money that usually came with aggressive negotiations, appraisals, and months of legal wrangling. They were offering it immediately, in cash, with a closing date set for just 10 days away. That was the first alarm bell that finally managed to ring through the fog of my exhaustion. Men in gray suits do not pay above market value out of the kindness of their hearts. They do it because they know something you don't. I looked out the kitchen window. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the eastern ridge. I could see the massive oak tree standing tall against the horizon. The tree where Ruth was buried. Promise me you won't sell because someone makes loneliness sound like rest. Ruth's voice echoed in my mind, crystal clear, cutting through Serena's soft, manipulative assurances. I looked at Serena. She was watching me with an intensity that bordered on manic. The loving, concerned wife had vanished, replaced entirely by a woman holding her breath, waiting for a payout. Elias, she whispered, picking up a heavy brass pen from the table and pressing it into my palm. It's time. I looked down at the pen. It felt cold against my skin. I hovered the tip of the pen over the signature line. Trent. The attorney leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the pen. Marcus Vale stopped breathing. Serena's hand tightened on my shoulder, her fingernails digging slightly into my shirt, and then the sound of a heavy diesel engine shattered the quiet of the morning. Everyone in the room froze. I looked out the window. My daughter's muddy, dented pickup truck was tearing up the driveway. Taking the corner so fast the back tires kicked up a spray of gravel. Sri's face went completely pale. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking suddenly terrifyingly old. What is she doing here? Serena hissed, her voice dropping its sweet cadence, revealing the sharp, venomous panic underneath. I thought she was in Boulder today. She was supposed to be. Serena had specifically chosen this morning because Claire's public calendar showed a full-day consulting job 3 hours away. But Claire hadn't gone to Boulder. She had spent the morning sitting in the county clerk's office, waiting for the final certified copy of the Apex Minerals permit to clear. The heavy front door of the farmhouse slammed open. Heavy, muddy boots marched down the hallway. Claire stepped into the kitchen. She was wearing her canvas jacket, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her jaw set with a furious, unstoppable resolve. She was carrying a thick manila folder. Serena immediately stepped away from me, moving to intercept Claire before she could reach the table. Claire, this is a private meeting, Serena snapped, raising her hands as if to physically herd my daughter out of the room. Your father is finalizing some incredibly important retirement paperwork. You need to wait outside. Claire didn't even look at Serena. She didn't slow down. She simply used her shoulder to push past my wife with the kind of blunt physical force you use to move a stubborn gate. Claire walked straight to the table. She looked at Marcus Vale. She looked at Trent, then she looked at me. Dad, Claire said, her voice shaking with adrenaline, her eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. Don't sign that. The trap had been sprung, but Serena hadn't caught me. She had caught herself. I set the heavy brass pen down on the oak table. It landed with a dull, final thud. I didn't look at Marcus Vale. I didn't look at Trent. I didn't even look at Serena. I looked at my daughter. Claire was standing at the end of the table, her chest heaving slightly. Her hands planted flat on either side of the manila folder she had just dropped. She wasn't the petulant, greedy child Serena had spent months describing. She was a fiercely intelligent woman standing in her mother's kitchen, ready to burn the room down to protect her family. "What is this, Claire?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Before Claire could answer, Serena lunged forward, her hands outstretched, trying to pull the folder off the table. "Elias, don't listen to her!" Serena cried, her voice pitching into a shrill, desperate register. I told you she would try to ruin this. She's just trying to stop the sale so she can keep the inheritance. This is exactly what I warned you about." I reached out and clamped my hand down on the folder, pinning it to the table. Serena's fingers hit the back of my hand. She tried to pull, but I didn't move an inch. I looked up at her. Her eyes were wide, panicked. The facade of the devoted wife completely shattered. "Sit down, Serena," I said. "But Elias," I said, "sit down." Serena slowly pulled her hand back, sinking into the chair next to me, her breath coming in short. Erratic gasps. I opened the folder. I read the title of the first document out loud. Preliminary Lithium and Rare Earth Mineral Assessment. Prepared for Apex Minerals. Subject Property, Whitaker Ranch. I looked at Marcus Vale, the slick, confident executive who had just offered me $2.4 million for agricultural land, was suddenly sitting incredibly still. His associate, Trent, was already reaching for his briefcase, looking like a man preparing to flee a crime scene. "You offered me agricultural value, Mr. Vale," I said, tapping the report. "Did you test the soil on my eastern ridge without my permission?" Marcus cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie. "Mr. Whitaker, as part of any standard due diligence process, we conduct preliminary environmental." "You drilled deep core samples," Claire interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. "You didn't test the topsoil for nitrogen. You drilled for a lithium brine deposit. And you found one. A massive one." Claire pulled a second piece of paper from the folder and slid it across the table. It was a printout of the email chain between Serena and Marcus. "And you knew exactly what you found," Claire continued, glaring at Marcus, "because you discussed it with my stepmother. You explicitly coordinated a strategy to buy the surface rights and bury a subsurface mineral transfer in the agricultural contract before my father knew what he was sitting on." Trent, the attorney, sat forward, trying to salvage the legal integrity of the meeting. "Now see here, Miss Whitaker," Trent said sharply. "This is a voluntary negotiation. Your father is of sound mind. We made a generous cash offer for the property as is. There is no legal obligation for a buyer to disclose proprietary internal assessments during a real estate transaction." "You're right," Claire said, leaning over the table. "You don't have to disclose your assessments, but a broker has to disclose her commission." Claire dropped the third document onto the table. It was the private commission and finder's fee agreement. I picked it up. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a rage so profound it felt like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. I read the terms. 7% of the future mineral lease valuation. A massive upfront cash bonus if the sale closed before the end of the month. And at the bottom of the page, signed in the same neat looping handwriting that addressed my birthday cards, was Serena's signature. I slowly turned my head to look at the woman I had married. Serena was weeping. Real, genuine tears were streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a woman who had just watched a lottery ticket catch fire in her hands. "Elias, please," Serena sobbed, reaching for my arm. "You don't understand. I was trying to get us the best deal. I knew the farm was valuable, and I wanted to make sure we were taken care of. I was trying to save you." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. "You told me the farm was killing me, Serena," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You told me I was old and tired and that you just wanted me to rest." "I do," she cried. "Then why were they paying you when I signed?" Serena's mouth opened, but no words came out. The truth was absolute, undeniable, and sitting right there on the oak table in black and white. She hadn't been acting as my wife. She had been acting as their broker. Marcus Vale stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Clearly, there is a family dispute that needs to be resolved here," Marcus said, attempting to project an air of professional detachment. "Mr. Whitaker, our offer remains on the table for the next 48 hours. We acted in good faith and we would still like to." "Good faith does not hide a mineral report from the landowner," Claire fired back. "And the offer isn't on the table. Because you can't buy it." "We have a signed non-disclosure agreement with your wife," Trent argued, snapping his briefcase shut. "She has legal standing as a spouse to facilitate. She has no standing at all." The voice came from the hallway. Robert Gaines, the senior family attorney who had handled my father's estate and my late wife's affairs, walked into the kitchen. Claire had called him 2 hours earlier. The moment she had secured the documents from the county clerk's office. Robert was 68 years old, wore suspenders, and possessed the kind of quiet, terrifying legal authority that didn't require raising his voice. He walked to the table and placed a single weathered document next to the lithium report. It was Ruth's will. Before Ruth Whitaker passed away, Robert explained, looking directly at Trent, she established a conservation covenant within the Whitaker family trust. Because the original deed was held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, the property passed entirely to Elias. Trent sneered. "Exactly. Which means he can sell it. He can sell the surface rights," Robert corrected him smoothly. But Ruth anticipated that a grieving widower might eventually become vulnerable to outside influence. So, she placed the subsurface and mineral rights of this ranch into an irrevocable family trust. Elias is the primary beneficiary, but he cannot unilaterally sell or transfer the mineral rights without an independent appraisal and the unanimous consent of the trustee board. Robert looked at Serena, his eyes cold and unyielding. Furthermore, Robert continued, the trust contains a very specific conflict of interest clause. If a new spouse attempts to initiate a sale of the property while holding a hidden financial interest, say, for example, a fraudulent, undisclosed finder's fee with a mining corporation, the trust strictly prohibits the transaction. Robert tapped the contract Marcus had brought. "Section 14 of your contract attempts to claim the subsurface rights," Robert said. "You can't buy them, because Elias doesn't have the legal authority to sign them away today. And even if he did, the moment Serena signed that commission agreement, she legally poisoned the sale. This contract is void." Before Marcus could even open his mouth to argue, heavy footsteps echoed from the porch. Hank Miller stepped into the kitchen, removing his battered Stetson hat. The old rancher looked at Serena, then at Marcus. "Those trucks came through the back gate with a key." "Elias," Hank said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "I watched them drill your eastern ridge for 6 hours. Robert looked at Trent. "An unauthorized access waiver signed by a non-owner to facilitate a geological survey isn't just a breach of contract, counselor. It's a county violation and potentially criminal trespass." Trent turned to Marcus, his face pale. "You didn't tell me the mineral rights were severed in a trust." "I didn't know," Marcus hissed, turning his fury entirely onto Serena. "You told us the title was clean. You said the spouse consent was fully secured. I didn't know about a trust," Serena cried, shrinking back as the men from Apex turned on her. "He never told me about a trust." "I didn't tell you," I said, leaning back in my chair, "because Ruth asked me not to." I looked at the weathered copy of Ruth's will on the table. My late wife hadn't just built a life with me. She had built a fortress to protect me after she was gone. She knew that grief made people blind, and she had installed a legal failsafe to ensure that I couldn't be manipulated into throwing our legacy away. I reached across the table, grabbed the $2.4 million contract, and slid it back across the oak wood until it hit Marcus's briefcase. "Take your paper off my wife's table," I said. Marcus Vale snatched the contract, shoving it into his briefcase. "This is a waste of time," Marcus muttered, glaring one last time at Serena. "We're done here." He and Trent didn't say goodbye. They turned and walked quickly out the front door, the heavy sound of their boots retreating down the hallway, followed by the roar of their SUV starting in the driveway. The kitchen was suddenly very quiet. It was just me, Claire, Robert, and Serena. Serena sat at the table, staring at the empty space where the $2.4 million contract had been. Her breathing was ragged. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a desperate, calculating panic. She was trying to figure out which mask to put on next. "Elias," she whispered, reaching for my hand again. "Elias, please. We can still move to Denver. We can just sell the surface rights. We can still have the life I promised you." I pulled my hand away. I looked at her white silk blouse. I looked at her delicate gold necklace, and then I looked past her, out the window, toward the eastern ridge, where my family had bled into the dirt for 100 years. "You didn't want to give me a better life, Serena," I said. "You just wanted to cash out my death." "I'm your wife," she pleaded, the tears flowing freely now. "I took care of you." "You took care of an investment," I corrected her. "You told me I was broken, so I would surrender the one thing that made me whole." I stood up from the table, my knees aching, but my spine straighter than it had been in years. "You did not hate the farm, Serena," I told her, delivering the final, inescapable truth. "You hated that it belonged to my family before it could belong to you." I turned to Robert. "Call the locksmith," I said, "and draft the divorce papers." Serena let out a sharp, devastated sob, burying her face in her hands. I didn't stay to comfort her. I walked around the oak table, placed my hand on Claire's shoulder, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the woman who had tried to bury me sitting alone with the dirt she couldn't steal. The eviction of Serena Whitaker from the property she had tried to steal was not a slow, drawn-out legal process. It was a swift, absolute surgical strike orchestrated by Robert Gaines. Within 2 hours of Marcus Vale fleeing my kitchen, Robert had filed an emergency injunction with the county judge. Using the fraudulent commission agreement and the unauthorized soil sampling as primary evidence, Robert secured a temporary restraining order based on financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Serena was given exactly 45 minutes to pack her personal belongings. She didn't pack quietly. She moved through the farmhouse like a cornered animal, pulling clothes from the closet, sobbing hysterically, and occasionally stopping to scream at me from the hallway. She tried to claim that I was making a mistake, that Claire was manipulating me, that she had genuinely loved me. I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I sat on the porch with Hank Miller, who had driven his truck over the moment he saw Robert's car pull up. Hank and I drank black coffee and watched the horizon while the sheriff's deputy stood in my foyer, making sure Serena didn't try to take anything that didn't belong to her. When she finally dragged her suitcases out to her car, she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I was trying to give you a better life." "Elias!" she cried, her makeup ruined, her voice ragged. "You're going to die out here, and no one is going to care." I looked down at her from the porch. "No, Serena," I said, my voice steady against the winter wind. "You were trying to sell the one Ruth gave me." She threw her suitcases into her car, slammed the door, and drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled quickly back into the dirt. The legal fallout for Apex Minerals was severe. 2 days after the failed signing, a senior executive from Apex called Robert Gaines, frantically trying to salvage the situation. They offered to fire Marcus Vale immediately. They offered to tear up the original contract and negotiate a legitimate, highly lucrative mineral lease that would pay me royalties for the rest of my life. I told Robert to decline the offer and to file a formal complaint with the State Mining Commission. Apex had trespassed on private property, conducted unauthorized geological surveys under a shell company, and attempted to execute a predatory contract through a hidden broker. The state launched a full investigation. Marcus Vale was suspended pending a corporate review, and Apex Minerals found themselves embroiled in a public relations nightmare that tanked their regional stock value. The county ordered every core sample taken from my land sealed and surrendered. The boreholes on the eastern ridge were photographed, catalogued, and marked as evidence. For the first time, the scars they left in the pasture looked less like damage and more like proof. Apex did not protect Serena. Corporations do not protect failed brokers. Marcus Vale's internal emails proved Serena had represented the Whitaker title as clean and the spouse consent as secured. Within a week, Apex's attorneys sent her their own demand letter, accusing her of misrepresentation and seeking to recover the expenses of the illegal survey. The divorce from Serena was finalized with brutal efficiency. Because she had actively engaged in financial fraud against the marriage, the judge invalidated any claim she might have had to alimony or a division of my liquid assets. She walked away with exactly what she had brought into the marriage: her clothes, her car, and a reputation that ensured she would never work in agricultural real estate again. A month after the dust had finally settled, the farmhouse felt different. It was quiet again, but it wasn't the suffocating, heavy silence of grief. It was the peaceful, enduring quiet of a sanctuary that had survived a siege. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over a stack of feed bills when Claire walked in. She didn't knock. She just let herself in, wiping her boots on the mat, carrying a cardboard box filled with old photographs she had taken from her apartment to digitize for me. I watched her unpack the box. She had Ruth's eyes. She had my stubborn jaw. She was the best thing I had ever helped create, and I had almost let a stranger convince me she was my enemy. "Claire," I said softly, setting my pen down. She looked up, pausing with a stack of photos in her hand. "Yeah, Dad, I owe you an apology," I told her, the words feeling heavy but necessary in my throat. "I let her isolate me. I let her convince me that you were just waiting for me to fail. I was so tired and I was so lonely, and I stopped trusting the people who actually bled for me. I'm sorry." Claire set the photos down on the table. She walked over, pulled up a chair, and sat next to me. She didn't look angry. She just looked incredibly sad for the pain I had been carrying. "Dad, I wasn't trying to take the farm," Claire said, reaching out to hold my calloused hand. "I was trying to give it back to you before you signed it away." "I know," I whispered, squeezing her hand. "I know you were." We sat there in the quiet kitchen for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the old window frames. "I've been talking to Robert," I said finally, breaking the silence, "about the trust and about the lithium under the eastern ridge." Claire tensed slightly. The reality was that we were sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar deposit. Even with Apex Minerals gone, another company would eventually come knocking. The temptation of that kind of money was a heavy burden for anyone to carry. "What did Robert say?" Claire asked cautiously. "He said we have options," I replied. "We could lease it, we could sell the subsurface rights independently, or we could trigger a permanent conservation easement on the entire 300 acres. Claire's eyes widened. A conservation easement meant the land could never be commercially developed or mined. It would be legally locked as an agricultural and ecological preserve in perpetuity. It meant giving up tens of millions of dollars. "Dad," Claire said slowly, "are you sure? That's generational wealth you'd be walking away from." I looked out the window toward the eastern ridge. "Generational wealth isn't always cash, Claire," I said. "Sometimes it's the right to leave the dirt exactly the way you found it." The next morning, Robert Gaines drove out to the ranch with a new set of papers. This time, there were no men in charcoal suits. There were no hidden clauses. There were just 3 people sitting around an oak table, protecting a legacy. I signed the conservation easement, permanently shielding the Whitaker Ranch from any future mining claims. The lithium would stay buried in the dark, exactly where it belonged. Later that afternoon, Claire and I walked out to the eastern ridge to check a section of fencing that had come loose in a recent storm. The winter air was sharp and clean, The cattle were grazing quietly in the lower pasture. We reached the top of the ridge, stopping near the massive oak tree where Ruth was buried. I leaned against a wooden fence post, taking the weight off my bad knee, and looked out over the sprawling, rugged beauty of the land. It was hard work. It would always be hard work. But for the first time in years, the work didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a privilege. I looked at the gate leading into the upper pasture. A weathered wooden sign hung from the top rail. The letters carved deep into the wood by my father 50 years ago. Whitaker Family Ranch. Serena thought the farm was old dirt and tired fences. She thought she could buy my exhaustion and sell my history. But Ruth knew better. Land remembers who stayed, it remembers who lied, and it remembers who only came close when they smelled money under the roots. I reached out and patted the wooden fence post. Feeling the rough, enduring grain under my palm, I was staying right here. If you were Elias, would you have signed the conservation easement, walking away from millions of dollars just to keep the land untouched? Or would you have found a way to mine the lithium and keep the farm? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories.